The Last Appeal. Chapter 1. The Verdict. Clay Eastman sat in the packed courtroom, heart pounding in his chest as the jury foreman rose to deliver the verdict. The air was thick with tension, a suffocating anticipation that made it hard to breathe. Clay wiped his sweaty palms on the fabric of his suit, his gaze fixed on his client, Ethan Pierce. A man in his mid-30s, Ethan sat stoically beside him, his face devoid of emotion, but the shadows in his eyes told Clay all he needed to know. Ethan had lost hope. "All rise," the judge commanded. The room echoed with the shuffle of feet as everyone stood. The foreman cleared his throat and looked down at the piece of paper in his hands. Clay's mind raced. This was the culmination of months of grueling work, sleepless nights, and countless hours of preparation. He'd combed through every piece of evidence, every witness statement, but nothing had broken the seemingly impenetrable wall that had formed around Ethan's case. The prosecution had painted him as a monster, a cold-blooded killer responsible for the murder of a wealthy businessman in a grisly execution-style killing. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Pierce, guilty of murder in the first degree. The words hit Clay like a punch to the gut. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but all Clay could hear was the ringing in his ears. Guilty. The word echoed in his mind as if it was mocking him. His heart sank. The judge's gavel struck the sound block. The defendant is hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection. Clay's vision blurred. He turned to Ethan, but the man remained eerily calm. Almost too calm. Ethan's eyes met Clay's, and for a brief second, a flicker of something, resignation, passed between them. The courtroom emptied around them. Reporters rushed to the steps outside, hungry for a headline. But Clay stayed seated, staring at the table. How had it come to this? He had believed Ethan, believed in his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence. Now, his belief had been shattered. Ethan was led away in chains, and as the door closed behind him, Clay knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this be the end. There was something wrong with this case. He had felt it from the beginning. The trial might be over, but the fight for Ethan's life had just begun. As the courtroom emptied out, Clay gathered his files, his thoughts spinning wildly. He would appeal, of course, but appeals were long shots, especially with a death sentence on the line. He needed something big, something to break the case wide open. Clay stood in the silent courtroom, the echo of the judge's gavel still ringing in his ears. There was no going back now. His last appeal was just beginning. Are you enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to follow this suspenseful legal thriller as it unfolds. Chapter 2. A Mysterious Tip. Clay's office was dimly lit, the shadows of the city's skyline creeping through the windows. It was late, too late for him to still be here, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was missing. He sat at his desk, files strewn across every available surface, poring over every detail of Ethan's trial again. But nothing stood out. The prosecution's case had been strong, too strong, perhaps. It was as if they had known exactly where to look, exactly which pieces to present to ensure Ethan's conviction. The phone on his desk rang, startling him out of his thoughts. Who could be calling at this hour? "Eastman," he answered, his voice weary. There was silence on the other end. Then, a voice, low and hushed, spoke. "You're looking in the wrong place, counselor." Clay's pulse quickened. "Who is this?" "That doesn't matter. What matters is you've been chasing the wrong story. They've framed him. Pierce is innocent, but you won't find the truth in the courtroom." "What do you mean? Who's they?" The voice paused, as if considering how much to reveal. "Dig deeper. Look into Judge Calloway's connections. Follow the money." Click. The line went dead. Clay stared at the receiver in his hand, his mind racing. Judge Calloway? The presiding judge over Ethan's case? What could this possibly mean? He had no leads, no reason to suspect the judge of any wrongdoing. But something about the caller's tone had struck a nerve. The conviction in his voice, the urgency. It was enough to plant a seed of doubt in Clay's mind. He hung up the phone and stared out the window into the dark city below. Who could that have been? A disgruntled insider? Someone with information they weren't supposed to have? And then there was the cryptic suggestion to follow the money. He had no idea what that could mean, but it was clear that if he wanted to save Ethan's life, he had to dig deeper. He had to follow every lead, no matter how unlikely. Suddenly, the mountain of evidence he had meticulously reviewed seemed hollow. There were cracks in the foundation of this case, but he hadn't noticed them before. Now they seemed too obvious to ignore. Clay knew he couldn't afford to wait. Ethan's execution date loomed, and with each passing day, time was running out. The mysterious tipster might have given him the break he needed, if he could figure out what it meant. Judge Calloway, the money, a frame-up. It was a dangerous game, but Clay had no choice but to play. Chapter 3. A Dark Trail. The next morning, Clay found himself sitting in his car outside the courthouse, staring at the imposing building. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him since the phone call. Who was that caller? Could they be trusted? There was no way to know, but he was running out of time and options. If there was even a chance that the judge had ties to something shady, he had to explore it. He spent the day combing through public records, pulling anything he could find on Judge Calloway. On the surface, the judge's career seemed spotless. Decades on the bench, respected by colleagues, never a scandal or even a hint of misconduct. But Clay knew better than to trust appearances. The more perfect someone seemed, the more likely they were hiding something. By late afternoon, his eyes burned from staring at his computer screen, but finally he found something. A financial disclosure form from a few years back. Most of it was mundane, the usual assets and accounts, but one item caught his eye. A sizable deposit made to an account linked to a corporation Clay had never heard of, Danton Enterprises. It seemed out of place, but without more context, it didn't mean much. Still, the name gnawed at him. Clay couldn't shake the feeling he had heard it somewhere before. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of his office. Who were these people? A knock on his office door broke his concentration. His assistant, Marla, poked her head in, concern etched across her face. "Clay, you've got a visitor. He's asking for you by name." "Who is it?" "Says his name is Stephen Danton." Clay's blood ran cold. The name, Danton. This couldn't be a coincidence. His mind raced as he stood, trying to keep his composure. "Send him in." A few moments later, a man entered the office, sharply dressed and carrying an air of confidence. His smile was cool, almost too perfect, and as his eyes scanned the room, Clay felt like he was being assessed, judged. "Mr. Eastman," Danton began, his voice smooth, "I hear you've been looking into some things that might not concern you." Clay's heart pounded, but he kept his expression neutral. "You're the one connected to Judge Calloway's financial records, aren't you?" Danton's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say, I have business interests that align with the judge's decisions. I'd suggest you back off, counselor." "So, this is a threat?" Danton chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "Consider it a friendly warning. You're treading into dangerous territory. We wouldn't want you to get lost, now would we?" The room seemed to close in around them. Clay's instincts screamed at him to stand down, to stop digging. But that wasn't an option. Not with Ethan's life on the line. "What happens if I don't back off?" Clay asked, his voice low but steady. Danton's eyes darkened. "Then people you care about might get hurt. And that's not something either of us wants, is it?" Without another word, Danton turned and walked out of the office, leaving Clay standing there, shaken but more determined than ever. This was bigger than he had imagined. Much bigger. He needed to act fast. If Danton and Judge Calloway were involved in a conspiracy, there had to be proof, and he had to find it before it was too late. As the door clicked shut behind Danton, Clay knew one thing for sure. He was in over his head, but there was no turning back now. What do you think will happen next? Subscribe and share to see Clay's next move as he faces the growing danger. Chapter 4. A dangerous proposition. The following evening, Clay sat in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee. His mind was spinning, replaying the conversation with Danton over and over. He felt the weight of the threat hanging over him like a noose tightening with every passing hour. Danton wasn't bluffing, Clay was sure of that. But if he backed down, Ethan was as good as dead. The bell over the diner's door jingled, and a man slid into the booth across from Clay without a word. It was Ben Carlisle, an old friend and former private investigator. Clay had called him earlier, desperate for help, and Ben was the only person he trusted with something this dangerous. "You look like hell, Clay," Ben said, his voice low. "What's going on?" Clay leaned forward, keeping his voice just above a whisper. "I've stumbled onto something bigger than I expected. Ethan Pierce didn't kill anyone, Ben. He's being framed, and I think Judge Calloway's involved. There's this guy, Danton, who's pulling the strings behind the scenes." Ben raised an eyebrow. "Danton Enterprises?" Clay's pulse quickened. "You've heard of them?" Ben nodded grimly. "Yeah, I've heard whispers. They're dirty, Clay. Real dirty. They've got their hands in a lot of shady deals, corruption, bribery, you name it. If they're involved in this, you're playing a dangerous game." "I don't have a choice," Clay said, his voice hardening. "They're framing Ethan for murder. If I don't stop them, he's going to die." Ben sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. "All right, I'll help you. But you need to be careful, Clay. These guys don't mess around. If Danton's threatened you, he means it." "I know," Clay muttered, "but we're running out of time. Ethan's execution date is set, and I can't file an appeal without solid evidence. We need to find something that ties Danton and Calloway to this setup." Ben leaned back, his eyes scanning the room. "I'll see what I can dig up on Danton. In the meantime, keep your head down. If they realize you're still coming after them, they'll make a move." Clay nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude toward his friend. This was more than just a case now, it was a battle for survival, and every move had to be calculated carefully. As Ben stood to leave, Clay caught his arm. "Thanks, Ben. I owe you." Ben gave him a small, tight smile. "You'll pay me back by staying alive." Clay watched as Ben walked out into the night, a heavy sense of dread settling in his gut. The clock was ticking, and every second brought him closer to a deadly confrontation. He was deep in enemy territory now, and the only way out was through the truth. Do you feel the tension rising? Subscribe and share to see how Clay navigates the dangerous conspiracy unfolding around him. Chapter 5. The Hidden Evidence. Clay hadn't slept in over 24 hours, his mind racing with the weight of what was at stake. Ben was out chasing leads, but Clay couldn't afford to sit idly by. He had gone back to the courthouse, poring over more records and financial documents in search of anything that could tie Danton Enterprises directly to Judge Calloway. He felt close, but the pieces of the puzzle still didn't fit together perfectly. As he sat hunched over a stack of papers, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was Ben. "I've got something," Ben's voice crackled through the line. "But we need to meet. Now, you're not going to believe this." Clay grabbed his coat and was out the door within minutes, his heart pounding in anticipation. He drove quickly to the agreed-upon location, a small parking lot near the river, just far enough from the city that no one would bother them. Ben was already there, leaning against his car, his face serious. "What did you find?" Clay asked as soon as he stepped out of his vehicle. Ben handed him a manila folder, thick with documents. "Danton's company is a front. They're funneling money to high-level officials all across the state. Judges, politicians, law enforcement. Calloway's just one piece of a much larger operation." Clay's hands shook as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. Bank transfers, emails, private communications, it was all there. Danton Enterprises had been buying influence for years, and Ethan's case had been part of their game. The man Ethan was accused of killing? He wasn't just a businessman. He had been about to blow the whistle on Danton's operation. That's why he was silenced. "This is it," Clay said, his voice breathless. "This is the proof I need." "Hold on," Ben said, raising a hand. "It's not that simple. If you use this, you're exposing some very dangerous people. They won't just come after you. They'll come after anyone close to you." Clay swallowed hard. He knew what Ben was saying was true. Taking this to court would be a declaration of war. But there was no other way to save Ethan. "I don't have a choice, Ben," Clay said, his voice firm. "If I don't act, Ethan dies. And this corruption continues. I can't live with that." Ben nodded, his expression grim. "Then you'd better be ready for what's coming." The wind whipped through the parking lot as they stood in silence, both men fully aware of the danger ahead. Clay was about to walk into the lion's den with nothing but the truth to protect him. And in a world as corrupt as this, truth was a fragile shield. But it was all he had. Are you hooked yet? Subscribe and share to see what happens when Clay confronts the conspiracy head-on. Chapter 6. The Last Appeal. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable as Clay stood before the appellate judges. The documents Ben had uncovered were in his hand, but their weight felt heavier than any file he had ever carried. This was his last chance. Ethan's execution was scheduled in less than a week, and without this evidence, his appeal would be denied, sealing his fate. Clay could feel the eyes of Danton's associates in the gallery, watching him closely. They knew what was coming. They had tried to stop him, offering bribes, issuing threats, even an attempt to have his car tampered with the night before. But nothing would deter him now. He had come too far. He was too close. As he began his argument, he laid out the facts, careful and methodical. Ethan Pierce had been framed, the evidence manipulated, the witnesses coerced. Then, he brought the bombshell: Judge Calloway's ties to Danton Enterprises and the massive corruption that had infected the judicial system. The courtroom buzzed as he handed the documents to the judges. He could see the shock in their eyes as they read the incriminating details. It was undeniable. This man, Ethan Pierce, was railroaded by a corrupt system, Clay said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "He is innocent, and if we don't stop this now, the same system will take an innocent life." The courtroom fell silent. Clay's heart hammered in his chest as he waited for the judges to speak. The seconds stretched into an eternity, and every tick of the clock seemed to echo louder than the last. Finally, the head judge looked up from the papers, his face solemn. "Mr. Eastman, the evidence you've presented is compelling," he began. "But accusations of this magnitude require thorough investigation. We cannot, in good conscience, move forward with the execution of Mr. Pierce until a full inquiry into these claims has been conducted." Clay exhaled, the weight lifting off his shoulders for the first time in weeks. It wasn't over yet, but it was a victory, a reprieve. Ethan would live to see another day. But as Clay walked out of the courtroom, he knew this was only the beginning. Danton's empire was vast, and his enemies were powerful. They wouldn't let this go easily. As he stepped into the bright sunlight outside, Clay's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "Congratulations," the familiar voice of Danton purred. "But don't think this is over, Eastman. You've made enemies today, and enemies have a way of catching up to you." Clay paused, the warning settling in his gut like lead. He looked out at the city, knowing that the battle for Ethan's freedom had only scratched the surface of the corruption beneath. He had won this round, but the war was far from over. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.